In the summer of 1944, the train rattled through the heart of Texas, carrying a cargo unlike anything the locals had ever seen. Young German women, dressed in faded uniforms, sat quietly in the railcars, their faces a mix of exhaustion and uncertainty. Among them was Liesl Weber, barely 19, her hands clutching a small canvas bag as the Texas sun beat down outside. The war in Europe was still raging, a distant storm of fire and steel, but here, in this sprawling, unfamiliar land, something entirely different was unfolding. Liesl had been taught to fear America. Its people, its soldiers, its chaos. Propaganda had painted them as brutal, uncultured, even monstrous. She braced herself for cruelty, for humiliation, perhaps worse. But as the train slowed and she stepped onto the dusty platform, the reality shocked her. A man in a wide, brimmed Stetson hat, his drawl thick and slow, handed her a cold glass of water. His smile was gentle, not mocking. Another offered a handkerchief scented with lemon, as if she were a guest, not a prisoner of war. Liesl stood frozen, her boots sinking into the dry earth, the smell of hay and dust filling her lungs. This was not the America she'd been warned about. Back in Berlin, Liesl's life had been shaped by the war's relentless grip. She grew up on ration cards and the wail of air raid sirens, her childhood interrupted by the loss of 2 brothers to the Eastern Front. At 17, driven by a mix of duty and desperation, she volunteered as a Luftwaffe auxiliary, hoping to make a difference, perhaps tend to wounded soldiers. Instead, she found herself stationed near a munitions site in France, captured by American forces just weeks after D-Day. The rumours began even before she boarded the transport ship across the Atlantic. Packed below deck, seasick and silent, the women whispered tales of horror, stories of French girls assaulted by guards, prisoners thrown overboard. There was no evidence, but fear thrives on repetition, and by the time they reached the United States, Liesl and the others had steeled themselves for the worst. They made silent vows: obey, avoid eye contact, survive. But the America they encountered defied every expectation. The train to Texas rolled past endless cornfields and sleepy towns, signs in English they couldn't read, and people who looked startlingly ordinary. Families stood on porches, waving as the train passed. Children ran alongside, laughing, their voices bright in the warm air. An old man tipped his hat, and Liesl saw one of her companions wipe away tears, whispering, "Why are they smiling?" No one had an answer. The train brought them to Camp Hearn, a prisoner of war camp in the American South, one of many built to house thousands of German captives, mostly men. Now, it made room for a small group of women, clerks, nurses, telephone operators, not hardened soldiers or SS guards, but young women who wore the uniform of the enemy. At the camp's gate, a sign read that the Geneva Convention was observed here, a promise that felt like a trick to Liesl's wary mind. Inside, the camp was nothing like the nightmare she'd imagined. The barracks were plain but clean, the air free of the stench of fear. There was a library with real books, an art studio with paint, even a choir practicing near a small chapel. The guards, young Americans from nearby states, were quiet, almost shy. They didn't shout or sneer. One even helped carry a girl's suitcase. Liesl stared at the bulletin board near the mess hall, where a schedule listed work assignments, chapel times, and, astonishingly, movie nights featuring American films. It felt surreal, as if kindness itself were a trap meant to break them. But as days turned to weeks, the pattern held. The food was strange. Eggs, sausages, even pie, but it was plentiful. The guards greeted them with nods, sometimes a "good morning," in accented English. No one touched them without permission, and slowly the women began to relax. They spoke more freely, wrote letters home, even laughed. One afternoon, Liesl stood by the camp's fence, watching young American guards play horseshoes under the blazing sun, country music drifting from a radio. Turning to her friend, she said, almost guiltily, This doesn't feel like prison." Her friend didn't reply, just smiled, brushing dust from her skirt. Camp Hearn was a strange world, a contradiction wrapped in barbed wire. From the outside, it looked like a prison, with watchtowers and fences, but inside, it felt more like a quiet college campus. Red gravel paths wound through tall pine trees, and the buildings were neatly painted, the air heavy with the scent of sweat and wood smoke. For Liesl, the contrast was dizzying. Mornings began not with screams or marching boots, but with birdsong and the soft clang of bells. The guards, mostly young men from Texas, Oklahoma, or Arkansas, treated the women with a reserved politeness. They followed orders but didn't revel in cruelty. Some went out of their way to make life bearable, like the guard who slipped Liesl's bunkmate, Helga, an extra bar of soap. "What's the catch?" Helga whispered, suspicious. There wasn't one. Life in the camp settled into a rhythm. There were rules. No leaving without an escort. No fraternization with guards. English encouraged but German allowed. No political organizing. Yet within those boundaries, the women found a surprising degree of freedom. They had jobs. Cooking, laundry, tending the grounds, but also opportunities for creativity. A sewing circle formed, and some women volunteered in the camp garden, coaxing vegetables from the dry soil. Others took English classes, eager to understand the world beyond the fence. Inga, a former pianist, discovered an upright piano in the chapel and began playing each evening. At first, she stuck to German folk songs, their melodies heavy with nostalgia, but after hearing a jazz broadcast on the camp radio, she tried a Gershwin tune, her fingers tentative on the keys. Within days, American guards gathered outside the chapel, listening in silence. No one spoke of it, but the gap between enemy and human was shrinking. Beyond the camp, the town of Hearn buzzed with curiosity. The locals had heard about the German prisoners, real Nazis, they whispered, shipped into their quiet corner of Texas. Some imagined monsters, fanatics with cold eyes. But what they saw were young women, barely out of their teens, tired and uncertain, trying to hold on to dignity in a land they didn't understand. Farmers drove past the camp, slowing to catch a glimpse. Children dared each other to approach the fence. One Sunday, a teenage boy tossed a baseball over the wire, then called out in halting German, asking for it back. A prisoner named Marta threw it, smiling shyly. The boy waved, and she waved back. It was a small moment, but for Marta, it carried weight. For the first time since her capture, she felt human, not like a criminal. By late summer, the war's toll on American farms created an opportunity. With most able-bodied men fighting overseas, labor was scarce. The War Department launched a program allowing carefully screened prisoners, including women, to work on local farms and ranches. It was practical. Keep the economy running, keep the prisoners occupied. The risk was low, they reasoned, and so Liesl and others began stepping through the camp gates, not as fugitives but as farmhands. They rode in pickup trucks through fields of cotton and corn, past barns where radios crackled with music and horses stirred in the shadows. They met ranchers, widows, housewives, and teenagers, people who watched them closely but also spoke to them, teased them gently, and treated them with a kindness that felt almost reckless. Liesl was assigned to a dairy farm run by Tom and Ruth, an older couple who asked not about the war, but whether she wanted lemonade. When she fumbled while milking a cow, Ruth laughed and said, "Honey, you'll get it next time." It wasn't friendship, but it wasn't hatred either. Each evening, as Liesl rode back to camp, she watched the Texas sky burn with the colors of sunset. The war felt distant, a faint echo in a world that was vast and strangely generous. She was still a prisoner, but she no longer felt like the enemy. Something deeper was stirring, not just in her but in others. Marta, her friend, was the first to admit she'd fallen for a farmhand named Jay, a young man who sang while he worked and slipped her wildflowers when no one was looking. Liesl noticed John, the rancher's son, quiet and strong, with hands rough from work and a voice free of the arrogance she'd expected. They didn't speak each other's languages well, but they found ways to communicate. Through shared tasks, mending fences, tending horses. Once, when his mother wasn't looking, he let Liesl ride a horse, her laughter startling even herself. He never called her names, and she never told him she'd once prayed for Germany's victory. Slowly, the myths they'd both been fed, about cruelty, about inhumanity, began to crumble. Not everyone approved. Some townsfolk were furious, muttering about American boys dying overseas while these German girls worked fields and shared smiles. A local preacher thundered about the dangers of foreign women seducing good Christian men. One farmer reported his neighbor for being too friendly with the prisoners. The army issued warnings about fraternization, but enforcement was half-hearted. The war was winding down, and exhaustion had settled over everyone. Guards, prisoners, townsfolk. They were tired of death, of fear, of division. So the rules softened, and in the cool of the evenings, something extraordinary took root. In barns and hidden groves, secret dances sprang up. Someone would bring a radio, another Coca-Cola or cigarettes, and under the Texas stars, American boys and German prisoners swayed to the sounds of Glenn Miller. They didn't talk about the war or politics. They spoke of movies, food, the lives they'd led before the world broke apart. Greta, one of the prisoners, later wrote of dancing barefoot in a shed, her hair loose, an American's hands gentle but sure. For those fleeting moments, she forgot she was a prisoner and remembered she was a girl. Some guards turned a blind eye, others stood watch, not to stop the dancers but to protect them. Everyone sensed that these moments were mending something broken. By early 1945, at least a dozen women in Camp Hearn were rumoured to be involved with locals, farmers, guards, townsfolk. Most were small, fragile connections, built on stolen glances and whispered conversations. A few faced consequences. A woman caught kissing a soldier was transferred. Another reassigned after a rancher's wife complained. But most were left alone. These were not grand love stories but quiet, defiant acts of humanity in a world that had tried to strip it away. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the news swept through Camp Hearn like wildfire. The women stood still, their work clothes dusty, their faces unreadable. There was no celebration, only a heavy silence. They had dreamed of peace, but not like this. Not as prisoners in a foreign land, not with their homes reduced to rubble and their families scattered. The War Department soon announced that all prisoners would be repatriated. For Liesl, it meant leaving John. They sat under a cottonwood tree, the place where they'd first connected without words. She had learned enough English to say, "I don't want to go." And he replied, "I know." They made promises, but Liesl didn't fully believe them, not because John was insincere, but because the world had a way of breaking fragile things. At the train station, the women stood with their canvas bags, some holding hands with Americans, others staring blankly at the platform. When the whistle blew, Liesl looked back. John stood there, hat in hand, his eyes holding something she couldn't name, neither sorrow nor hope, but something in between. In Germany, the return was harsh. The women faced suspicion, even contempt. Some were called traitors for having worked in soft posts. Others found their towns unwilling to acknowledge them. Jobs were scarce, food scarcer. But Liesl carried something untouchable. A photograph of the ranch, John's name, and a stubborn hope. She wrote to him, and months later, an answer came. He had been working to bring her back, navigating a new program called the War Bride Act. Though meant for women who married American soldiers in Europe, a loophole allowed former prisoners to return under strict conditions. It took petitions, letters, and affidavits from John's family, but in the spring of 1946, Liesl boarded a ship, not as a prisoner, but as a fiancée. She arrived in New York with a borrowed coat and John's address clutched in her hand. At the Texas station, he was waiting, his hat the same, his arms open. They married that summer, one of dozens of German women who returned to America as wives, not captives. In Herne, the whispers about Liesl faded over time. She worked hard, baked better bread than anyone in town, and smiled often. John rarely spoke of how they met, only saying she was a gift from a war that took too much. Not every story ended so neatly. Some women returned to Germany and vanished from record. Others married but struggled to bridge the gap between worlds. Yet for those who stayed, like Liesl, something profound endured. They were proof that even after the bloodiest war in history, love could find a way. Liesl and John built a small home on his father's ranch, with a wood stove and a porch swing. She planted sunflowers, though the dry soil resisted at first. Her accent never faded, but the town's caution did. She taught at the schoolhouse, sang German songs to children, and baked strudel for fairs. Slowly she became not the German girl but Mrs. Miller, one of their own. Greta, another former prisoner, opened a cafe in Austin with her husband, serving schnitzel alongside chili. Her daughter grew up with a Texas twang, saying grace before meals. Annalise, married to a preacher, taught Sunday school, while another woman became a nurse, caring for veterans who once guarded her. The irony was never lost on them. I was taught to fear these people, one said, and now they trust me with their children. Time softened the edges of memory. By the 1960s, their children were American, playing football, marching in parades, even serving in Vietnam. Liesl kept a box under her bed, her old uniform, a pressed flower from the day she met John, and the train ticket from 1945. She didn't speak bitterly of Germany, but when asked if she missed it, she'd say, "No one offers you lemonade on a train in Berlin." Decades later, at John's funeral, the church was full. The pastor, too young to have known the war, spoke of Liesl's grace, a woman who taught them love could come from unexpected places. That night, she sat on the porch swing, the cicadas humming, the fields stretching out where she'd once picked cotton and fallen in love. She whispered, "I came here as a prisoner, but I was set free." Near the end of her life, Liesl wrote a letter to her granddaughter Anna, who asked about her origins. "I left Berlin afraid," she wrote, "but America made me take off that fear piece by piece, with every act of kindness, every glass of lemonade. They told me the enemy had no heart, but this place showed me the truth. The enemy smiles, too." Liesl died in 1995, her gravestone reading, "Born in Berlin, died in Brenham, loved both." In a faded photo album, a snapshot remains a German girl in a cotton dress, a cowboy-hatted man beside her, smiling. Not posing, just smiling. She came in chains, stayed for love, and rewrote what it meant to be an enemy with the quiet choice to stay. The story of German prisoners in America is a forgotten thread of the war, not of battles or heroics but of human connection. Over 400,000 Germans were held in the US, a few hundred of them women like Liesl, auxiliaries, nurses, clerks. Most returned home, but some stayed, not out of force, but because they found love, not just with people but with the idea that an enemy could become a neighbor. In the fields and porches of Texas, they learned that forgiveness, though slow, is possible, and that history sometimes ends not with treaties, but with wedding rings.